Hi, and welcome to the Reclamation Project podcast. We're so glad that you're here, that you're listening, and hopefully that you are a part of the conversation. Today, we're going to just be looking into a component of life that I think is really well overlooked and has been for decades, but now it's coming to light a little bit. And it's a concept that I think we need to talk about because I think it's a concept that we may not see in our own lives, but we need to kind of work through and navigate through and really talk through. And that is the concept of having a better work-life ratio. And what I mean by that is we just really need to know how to draw boundaries, how to just change up our day in and out, and how we focus on work versus focusing on relationships and life and our spiritual life and just who we are, and making sure that we're building that up as much as we're building up our work life as well. So when it boils down to it, it's almost a concept of rest. And I really think that it's kind of a biblical concept in itself a little bit. It's something that, God talks about rest. He talks about having a day of rest, but he also talks about just rest and rejuvenation and rebirth. And with all of that, you kind of see the concept of needing some of that in your lives in a day-to-day function. To be able to have these great relationships, to be able to really function in a way that is fruitful and is growing and is continuing to change and evolve. And I know we hate that word evolve, but change and evolve into the person that God wants us to be. So that's what we're talking about today, is work-life ratio. It's kind of a newer concept too. This new generation of people that I'm kind of a part of, that Gary is definitely not a part of, it's millennials, right? Millennials are really diving into this work-life ratio concept because, to a certain extent, what they want is they don't want the life that their parents had, and with that, working and grinding is kind of a thing of the past. It's more of work and grind for the time that you're there, and then shut it off, and enjoy life and enjoy the things that life can give you. And so I see a lot of that from a management position, is that's how millennials have started working. And I've read a book, and if you're a manager, it's a great book if you're dealing with millennials. It's called Why Sizing Your Business by Jason Ryan Dorsey. And it just talks about some of that, how millennials really would rather take less pay and have a better life outside of work and not be tied to work as much than to take more pay and just be grinding and grinding and grinding. And so that's a part of the concept it for a younger generation, is really understanding how to balance that work-life ratio. And for me, who's on the higher part of that generation, it's something I've been trying to learn. And I really do think that we all need to look at it.
And let me interject here, I think, because I totally agree with everything you said. But as I've said on several podcasts, I'm a stickler for words, and I know millennials are too. So when you say rest, you could get a certain connotation. But let me give you another biblical phrase that kind of fits this too. It's just about being still. You remember when God told Moses just to be still and know that I am Lord. So rest sometimes feels like doing nothing. Being still means I'm actually active and mindful of what's going on. And so I think it's a great sister to what you're talking about when we talk about rest.
Yeah, and so I think this is a great concept. It's a concept of that a lot of us don't put into practice. It's a lot of us don't identify it in our own lives. We know that something's off, but we don't know what. We feel stressed. We feel busy beyond belief. We feel like we have to go, and we never feel like we get to where we're going, I think, in a lot of ways. So with that, we've brought in a guest today, and I've known her for a while. 7, 8, 9, 10 years, something like that. Worked with her at my place of employment. She is our CFO. But she left for a while and had an interesting journey and an interesting story of just how her life kind of changed. And so knowing that story, we felt like this might be a good place to have someone come in and really talk through how this practically looked in her life when she realized what she needed to do in response to knowing that something needed to change, and knowing that work-life ratio was off balance and kind of skewed more to the work more than the life. So we have Brenda today, and she is going to talk a little bit about how that worked in her life. So welcome, Brenda.
Thanks, Jeremy. So glad to be here. This is really exciting. I have never been on a podcast before, but I do like to tell stories. So
Well, this is the place for you.
awesome. All right, so I guess a little background.
Yeah, please.
I've been married for 17 years. Charles, my husband's name is Charles. And one of the non-negotiables in our marriage is that I would always work. That was just, even as kids came, any suggestion of me working anything less than full-time was simply not on the table for discussion. Now, Charles has always made up for this by helping out a lot with the kids and housework. So, since I enjoyed my work, I'm an accountant, CFO, since I enjoyed my work and also an equitable division of labor at home, that was okay.
Seemed fair?
Yeah, it kind of worked. I had, a number of jobs over the years. I worked in public accounting, and I was a CFO for a small business. Started to get a little bored, and an opportunity came along. Was it 2015?
Yeah.
2015, an opportunity came along, and I was offered a CFO job at kind of a small business, but like an upstart business in Chandler, and it was like 6-figure salary, no commute. Seemed like a really exciting opportunity, and so I jumped on it. Kind of took advantage of it. Left the work-life balance job that I had, and went into that. And at first, it was great, but it quickly became really, really demanding. And I've actually got a pretty high tolerance for work stress, but after about 8 months, it became so stressful that I started to consider resigning. And so at that point, it was more just my stress, but it was also starting to, the family was starting to suffer.
Yeah.
Kind of a thing.
So what were some of those stressful points there that were causing you to reconsider? Was it the hours? Was it the work itself? Was it, a coworker situation?
Yes.
Okay. What of those things made you or were high on the identity marker of, hey, this just isn't right?
Probably more than anything, it was the hours.
Okay.
There's a sense, when you're in finance, you're never done. There's always more that you can do. There's always more analysis. So it wasn't necessarily the being behind or the lack of accomplishment, although certainly that was there. It was certainly the hours and the management team, the people that I was working with. They were very challenging. It was hard to get things done. Those relationships weren't stellar.
Were those did you feel like those were more internal expectations or external expectations that were causing you to work those hours?
What a great question. I think I can honestly say external.
Okay.
Certainly there's of course some element. I'm internally driven person, but more external. It was a demanding position.
So how did you work through that? I'm not happy here, yet one of my non-negotiables is I have to work. I mean, that's some internal stress. The dialogue that that self-talk during that time. What was that like?
Yeah, it was really tough. I basically did what I always do when I have a tough decision to make. Is I asked several people for advice, and then I thought obsessively about it for a few weeks, and then honestly, I finally got around to praying about it, which is sort of my MO.
Welcome to the real world.
God's good though, because even when I'm sort of steeped in the sin of self-sufficiency, which I certainly was, there was this twirling of how am I going to solve this problem? How am I going to make all of the pieces fit properly into the box? When I finally brought it to him in prayer, he rewarded me with a really prompt response. And, God speaks to you in different ways, but that time, the way he responded was with this download. I don't know if you ever had this experience where you're praying and then all of a sudden you just get this massive amount of like knowledge that if you tried to explain it to somebody else,
Yeah.
it would take an hour to
And that's
walk
how you know
through.
it's not you.
Yes. It wasn't, I could articulate it, but it would take me an hour to articulate what the Lord gave me
Yeah.
right in that one moment. And the answer was clear. The answer was sit down, shut up, stop whining,
Yeah.
and serve your boss.
Yeah. Don't you hate when his answers aren't what you want?
Right. I was like, okay, I'll just keep it up. And so, I just redoubled my effort and got less sleep and just continued to try to make it work. Meanwhile, the issues at home they started to deteriorate. They
Yeah.
started having issues with the kids, started having relationship conflict with my husband. When you're elsewhere, your family feels it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
They know that you're not interested in what's going on with them because you're preoccupied with your work.
So did you identify, though, these are some red flags that feed the reason why I should probably leave, but yet I can't because I feel God told me like that. That's between a rock and a hard place.
That's a perfect description, Gary. I felt like I was between a rock and a hard place. I knew that it was not sustainable,
Yeah.
but I also knew that God said, stay.
Yeah. Yeah. He's
So-
funny like that.
He is funny like that. So, that happened January, February timeframe. And when the summer vacation started, kids got out of school. They, at the time, they were 10, 11, 14. So they weren't like in childcare. They were just home for the summer break. And we started having these really serious issues with one of my sons. Bad stuff like lying, sneaking out, stealing from the neighbors, and it was daily. I mean, there was something new every single day. He did what?
So is that contrary to really his personality? And do you think it was just acting out, or because you weren't there, or was it just the normal teenage junk that kids?
Well,
go
he's
through?
that particular kid is more of a handful than the other two,
Okay.
but he was surely acting out.
Sure.
He was unsupervised.
Yeah.
He was. It actually was interesting. I think in the end we were able to figure out that there was like this food addiction thing where he was stealing money to get money for a vending machine at camp, and that was what was driving him. But we didn't understand what was driving him because I wasn't around to
Right.
listen and talk, and it was just you messed up, here's your punishment. You messed up, here's your punishment. There was no time to
Yeah.
Really get to the root of it.
to get
Yeah.
to the root. Exactly. So so the pressure at work started to mount again, and the issues at home started to get out of control. It got so bad that I suffered kind of a nervous breakdown. One Saturday afternoon in July.
Kind of one or one?
I'm gonna say it was a nervous breakdown.
Okay,
All
yeah.
right. I'll tell you what happened, and you can tell me if it meets the definition of a
I mean,
nervous
people
breakdown.
say that, and it's like saying, "Well, I was kind of pregnant." Well, you were either pregnant or you weren't, and you either had so more than likely, yeah, you went through a little a crisis moment.
Yeah. So what happened was it was July, and I found myself crying on my bedroom floor, despairing over how I could possibly meet the obligations at work and deal with the issues of my family in the same time. I knew that the coming week at work was going to require more of me than I was capable of, even if everything at home was perfect.
Yeah.
And I freaked out. I packed a bag and I ran away from home. Does that qualify as a nervous
Yep.
breakdown?
Yeah. Ding, ding, ding.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not kidding. I slept on the floor of my office for 2
Really?
days. Okay, now I had been doing this wife and kids thing for a long time.
Yeah.
Very unusual behavior, but it was that elevated.
Wow.
And I slept on the floor of my office for 2 days. I got a hotel for a couple of nights, and I just worked for 15 hours a day because something had to stop.
Yeah. And then when you're working, your mind, you didn't have time to be stressed, or you were focused at work, right? So kept all the other outside woulda, shoulda, couldas at
I think
bay.
it was probably the closest I was ever to. They say men are like waffle pockets; they can compartmentalize. Women
Yeah.
can't do it as well. We're
Yeah.
spaghetti. It was the closest I've ever been able to get to waffle pocketing.
Yeah.
Where I'm like, nope, closing the door to
Yep.
the family thing, so I can just do this.
Wow.
Well, and how was that? How was that received by Charles and by your kids?
Yeah,
I mean, what
great
kind
question.
of happened with your family dynamic at that time? Because you're in this place where you're at work and you're in this hotel, but what are they thinking? What are they going through? What was their mindset at that point?
Yeah, they my middle son ended up telling me later that he was really scared. The other two boys, I'm an emotional woman. I think they just sort of like, mom's having a moment.
Yeah.
It wasn't quite too worrisome for them. It was pretty worrisome for one of my sons. My husband tried to be supportive. As I said, he was the kind of guy who recognized that to have a wife that worked full time, like there's some give and take there, and so he tried really hard to be supportive. And he didn't reveal to me at all that he was a wreck. He was totally broken up. That was probably when he started to see how far out of balance our family was. He didn't really see it before.
Was he a wreck because of you leaving, or was he a wreck because other things were going on in his life that were causing him to be a wreck, or was it a combo?
I think it was more that he actually was forced to see just how desperate I was and how bad a shape I was in, and he loves me.
And he had absolutely no control over any aspect of this.
Right. He found himself between the rock and the hard place.
Yeah.
The idea of giving up that, letting me quit my job and, giving up that level of salary. And meanwhile, I hadn't really asked him up to this point. I maybe have hinted, can I leave this terrible job? But the idea of giving up that salary, I guess, yes. I didn't have a sincere ask. It was more,
Well, I was going to ask, why was that, maybe you can't answer that, but why was that a non-negotiable for him going in? What was that about? He needed that security and certainty. Is that what it was?
Yeah. I think that as I kind of get through the rest of the story, we wouldn't have, maybe we didn't know it at the time, but he was driven by a major fear of financial calamity.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yep.
He grew up very poor.
Yep.
And he was a hard worker, but what was propping up his work ethic was an absolute paralysis over the idea of finances falling apart. That calamity.
That's pretty textbook too. That's amazing. Yeah. So, did he have a crisis moment then, or did you have a collective crisis moment?
We had independent crisis moments. He was having his crisis moment, and I was having my crisis moment.
And there was no communication that each of us was doing this?
None. In fact, he told me, he's like, listen, I'm not going to make you come home. I'm not nothing. He's promised me that you'll call someone.
Wow.
And so that was it. And then he didn't bother me. He basically let me leave for 4 days. No text messages, no frantic trying to get.
So can I ask you a question? As a woman, did you want him to pursue, or did it feel
No. He did absolutely the right thing.
Okay.
I needed to.
Because some personalities say leave me alone, but really what they really are saying is please, walk right by my hand that I'm putting up and come at me. But that wasn't you. You're like, okay, thanks for the space.
Yeah, and he knew that.
Okay.
So, all right. So he asked me. He's like, make sure you call someone. So on Tuesday night, I called my friend Anna, a longtime friend that I know from church. We've probably known each other almost 10 years, and we talked for about an hour and a half. 40 minutes of that time, we talked about work stress, and lesser time, maybe 20 minutes, we talked about family stuff. Because the family stuff is harder. Like, it's just harder. There's no solutions there. There's fewer labels. It's just hard. But, during the call, Anna said very frankly, she said, Brenda, I really think you need to quit this job. And I said, Anna, I totally agree. But God was super clear back in February that I was to stay put until I get released, or that I was to stay put, and then until I get released, I would be in error, like operating in my flesh is kind of a Christianese term for that. Yeah. She agreed. So when I said that, I told her the whole story. She agreed. So the next day, I get a random text message from my friend Adrian, again, another longtime friend from church. Random. It says, Brenda, I feel like the Lord keeps telling me that you need to quit your job.
So two of your friends have said the same thing.
Yeah.
And did you ever say, this looks like release?
No, I actually was worried that it was temptation. That was coming from the other direction, that there was...
Yeah.
I was being lured into making a decision contrary to what the Lord wanted me to do.
I really need to dig my feet in now.
Yeah. I literally set the text message aside and just kept working.
Yeah.
So that night, I'm still at the hotel, and that same friend Adrian that sent me the text message, she sent me a link to a podcast, and so I'm at the hotel that night and I'm listening to it, and it was about Elisha after he had succeeded in all of these things, he got really depressed and he ran away into the wilderness, right? Ran away.
Yeah. Wow, that resonated with you.
It did. It spoke to me on like
Yeah.
20 different levels. The part that I really remember that really spoke to me, the pastor who was giving the message, as if God talking directly to me, or as if he was talking direct to me, he said, God is really proud of you for running away to the broom tree and not the bar. Which was really huge for me.
How did you interpret that?
Well, it's kind of like, okay, so running away from home in response to your life being out of balance is not the right thing to do. That's an unrighteous, right? Do you know what I mean?
Right.
But even in kind of an unrighteous response to
Where you
stress,
run to is equally as important then.
you know, the where you run to, it's kind of, I actually took it more like, even in the middle of doing something unrighteous, God, if you let him, he'll come, he'll meet you there,
Yeah.
he'll pick you up, dust you off like a good father,
Yeah.
you know?
You didn't run away from your faith. You didn't run to another man. You didn't run to, so running is really is a lower rung. I don't even know if I would even consider that unrighteous, but it might not have been right. But looking back, it probably was the greatest thing that prompted your new recognition that things have to change. I don't know, without running away, if you ever would have got to that place.
Maybe not. But the Lord was definitely very kind and gracious to me, and really looped in people. Like, I mean, there were people interceding, and God was like in it. Other people were coming, and they didn't know. I was actually when I after this, listening to the podcast and feeling this peace and feeling really like the Lord was meeting me right there, I texted Adrienne back because I was still kind of suspicious of the timing of her intervention, and I asked her, I'm like, do you know what's going on in our life? Like, I figured she must if she sends me a podcast about running away, And her response was, I don't know anything. I don't know what's going on. All I know is that when I was in church on Sunday, Charles went up for prayer at the end. And I could see his countenance, and I could see that something really, really serious was going on in your family. And that's when I felt the prompting that it was okay to reach out to you in this particular manner.
And you understand that's sometimes how God speaks to us through other people.
Right.
Right.
Okay, so obviously I'm getting this release, right? But there's more. Like, there's even more to the story. I finally go home. Like, I went home the next day, and I'm sitting with Charles, and I asked him if I could quit the job. And he said yes. And he ended up telling me the story that previous Sunday when he was in church, he was so emotional that he went down for prayer, and during that time of prayer that Sunday morning, he felt God break that fear of financial calamity off of him, just broken. Wow. And he said, of course, quit your job, we'll figure it out. And the whole point of this story is not to say, hey, if your life is out of balance, quit your job.
Right.
Of course not.
Right.
There's order and there's chaos, and we're always going to have these times where things heat up and get difficult. But sometimes that is the answer. But don't just run. I mean, you can run with it if you want, but there's some value to taking it to God and being Spirit-led through it.
Yeah.
So I went to work the next day, and I told my boss that I needed to resign and explained why. And he was gracious, and the conversation ended with hugs, and we worked out a deal over the next couple of weeks where I'd work part-time from home while they looked for my
kind of phase yourself
replacement.
out.
So there was income for several weeks while we
give you a chance to give you some space to figure it out.
Yeah. So the grace was there to figure out the finances. I actually did get to be fully unemployed for almost a month. That was pretty awesome. It's the only time I've ever been unemployed in my whole life. And then, of course, I work full time again, but at something that is much closer to a balanced.
So what I hear you say, it's not really where you run to; it's really running to a different perspective, looking at something. Because my family had an intervention with me too when I left. Jeremy and I were part of the same ministry. He was my intern years and years ago. And then when I left, my family gave an intervention to me, and you spent more time with their family than you did ours. You spent more time with their kids than you did our kids. Actually, it sounds more like my wife had an intervention with me, which is probably a more correct way to say it. And it was about me not learning how to build boundaries in my life. And I remember it wasn't that much longer. I was reading, or the Bible says, he says, teach us to number our days. And I started fixating on that verse. So I'm kind of a geek when it comes to that. I overthink stuff. So I'm like, well, if I live to be 90, that's 32,000 days. And at my age then, I was already 22,000 days. So I have 10,000 days left. It changed my whole perspective of everything. So, and then when I realized when you say yes to something, you're also saying no to something else. So I had to think about that first before I said yes or no to anything.
That's good.
So,
well, and so you quit this job, you work part-time, and I know that you work with me now. So in between that, what are some of the things you had to sacrifice to get to this place where you're at? Besides, of course, income you're sacrificing, but what other things do you feel like you're sacrificing from yourself that, not that you needed, but that were things that were embodied in your lifestyle and who you were?
I'll be honest, it was all positive. It was all positive.
So it's not what you sacrifice, it's what you gain.
It's what we gained. Those 7 or 10 weeks or so where I was working part-time and not working at all for a little chunk, we connected as a family in a way that we never had because I've always worked full-time. There was just sort of deep therapy that came out of it. We all bonded. We got the issues with my one son understood and figured out where he was coming from. We made some diet changes that we found actually really helped that particular child a lot. But I had time to research, nutrition intervention and that kind of thing. It was all positive. I would say that our family was the happiest it ever was during that season where I was not working full time.
So did that make you a little fearful going into a job again? Like, I guess what
yes.
we're wondering is like, how do
yes.
I put boundaries there so this doesn't happen again? How did you work through that process?
I was definitely fearful of going to another full-time job. I took a part-time job for a while, loved it, enjoyed it. Honestly, it really comes back to the Lord's leading again. I was offered another full-time job. I didn't go looking for it. It kind of came to me, and I was resistant at first. I'm like, no, thanks. I'll pray for you.
Yeah. Pray that you find someone.
Yes, exactly. But again, I gave it up to the Lord, and the answer came back loud and clear. This is where I want you. And yeah, you do have to set boundaries. I mean, I have to be okay with closing the books in 15 days instead of 10. There are internal deadlines that I'd like to meet that I can't, and I just have to get okay with that. But
what about family boundaries? Did you sit down with your husband and come up with some family boundaries too? Like, does he have the freedom to come up to you and say, you're starting to do it again, I can see it? Do you have that kind of reconnection? Or because sometimes boundaries as expectations are mutually defined. Did you guys mutually define some boundaries?
I would say with regard to that, no. I think he kind of trusts me to figure out when things are getting escalated, and he's certainly now open to the discussion. There was definitely a time before when I was not allowed to complain about being out of balance, and I am allowed to talk about it now.
And it's not fair for you to talk for him, but how freeing was that for him to have that piece released, that fear of financial? I mean, he must be a different person.
He's a new man.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
And the kids are good. I guess I've given the kids permission. If I come home at 6 one night because I got tied up with something at work, I'll ask my kids, "Are you guys okay? Are you mad at me? Is this all right?"
Yeah.
And they'll tell me, like, "Mom, this sucks. Can you work less next week?" And most of the time they don't say that, but when they do, yeah.
Have you put any boundaries? We talked about boundaries that you and Charles may have come up with, boundaries that your kids are kind of alerting you to. But did you personally come up with boundaries on just what you were going to come in and do? Because so here's the perspective I'm coming from. Is I knew you before working at the same place. You were working 50, 60 hours. You come back and you're working more 40, 45 hours is what it seems like from an outsider's perspective, right?
Yeah.
So what kind of boundaries did you come come with coming in, hey, I'm not going to do this. I am going to do this. How I'm going to say yes and no to things. Were there any boundaries set around that so that you didn't get to the 50, 60 hours
You mean
again?
like with my employer?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Did you set
yeah.
some non-negotiables with them?
Absolutely.
Good for you.
What were those types of things?
Yeah.
What, if you don't mind sharing, because I think that helps people understand what boundaries they can impose on their jobs as well.
Yeah, that's tough. I don't know how it. I feel like if you're a good employee, if you're good at what you do, you're a person of integrity, a person of good character, you can develop I think almost anybody can develop a relationship with their boss.
Oh, absolutely.
In such a way that there's a mutual respect that I know you're giving me 100% of what you can give.
Yeah.
I can tell you that when I first came back, I told them I could work 9 to 4, that I needed a transition time, and he said, great, no problem. Now, we knew, of course, when you're running a department, that's not always practical.
Right.
There, you can't leave at 4 o'clock if everybody in your department is going to be staying till 9 o'clock, and I knew that. So there was kind of a transition, right, which my children needed. And then there has been at least 2 times where I was really bogged down, something changed, somebody in the department resigned, or things come up where I verbally said, or in an email, listen, I've been doing the 50, 55 hour thing. I'm doing it because it needs to get done, but I need you to know that, as soon as this project is done, I need to go back to my regular schedule.
And was that new for you, that kind of strength to be able to have that conversation? Because you seem like you're not afraid to speak your mind.
I'm pretty assertive, yeah.
Yeah.
It's still hard. It's hard to tell your boss, listen,
Yeah.
I'm not going to do this anymore. Even if you're assertive, that's a hard thing to do.
Yeah.
But I'm a boss, and Jeremy, you're a boss. If your employees are honest with you about what they're dealing with, that's a valuable thing as a boss. So as the employee trying to go in and say, listen, these are my boundaries, this is what I can do and what I can't do, you think you're going to get met with.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's something to do with the value, right? Is if you're, like you said, if you're a hard worker,
yeah.
a
I'm just
person,
going to say the same thing.
a person who's, valued, you can come in and say that. But if you're slacking off, if you're always taking breaks, if you're always on your phone, if you're always looking for the loophole,
Right.
then you come to me and say, hey, I need this. I'll be like, we can't, we
haven't
can't,
earned it.
we can't accommodate that. But for the person who's working hard, who will work over, who will, make sure that things get done that need to be done, it's like, yeah, you know what, I can give you a little bit more slack when you need it. And we'll just make other people, work harder, or I'll step in myself a lot. And that's my own work-life balance kind of issue.
Well, and I think what happens sometimes, or at least with mine, is you just kind of drop the expectations. You know what I mean? So it's not like other people have to work harder. It's, okay, it's unreasonable for you to get, in my case, month-end close is like the big thing. It's unreasonable for you to get month-end close by the 10th of the month. The 15th is fine.
Yeah. Well, and that's something I've had to learn over the years, is because we have stuff that has to go out same day. We have stuff that has to go out same week. And then even like this week, we come in on Monday and Tuesday and our servers are down and we can't do anything. On top of that,
That was really stressful.
On top of that, I'm coming off of vacation, so I'm trying to catch up. So Monday and Tuesday are pretty much just killers, not being able to do anything, get back on track, etc. So you're basically sitting around waiting for something to happen. And then Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, you're up and running, and you got to go basically from Wednesday at 12 to Friday, get a whole week's worth of work in. And so I reached out and said, hey, you know what? We're not going to be able to get everything out. We'll do our best. This is kind of what we'll do. I'll let you know at the end of the week, which I forgot to do, so I should probably send an email today. But we'll let you know what we didn't get out, what we did get out, etc. But this is the new.
You got my
expectation.
stuff done though, right?
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
but the concept is to be communicative, to set the expectations. It's kind of like relationships, right?
Well, absolutely.
As relationships, you set those expectations. You come to an agreement, and sometimes you just have to set those expectations and hope people agree, I think.
And sometimes you have to revisit them to see, are they valid at the moment? Again, have things changed? But you picked up on it, and I think it's worth repeating once again, is based on because we talk, what's it like to live a life as a believer, And I think because we already mentioned some of her attributes, she's a hard worker and she's a woman of integrity. So when a boss knows, I have Brenda here for 45 hours, I have 45 hours of Brenda, they're much more apt to work with you, negotiate with you. And then they know 45 hours of Brenda is just as good as 55 hours of someone who doesn't have all that. Yeah. So it speaks to living a life of integrity and of honesty and of I'm a person when my yeas are yeas and my no's are no's. When we talked about that series, what it means to live everyday life like a believer, it has its benefits even when it comes to an issue like we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of things that other people can take away. Is that's Brenda's story, but other people's stories may be different. But I think some of the same truths happen is if you're feeling overburdened, you're probably not in a good spot. So I think the concept is seek biblically, it's even seek advice of people who have been there. Seek advice of people who are older than you, who have that experience.
Wisdom in a multitude of counsel, the Bible says.
Yes, exactly. Take it to prayer.
Yep.
Pray through it, think through it, pray through it. Don't let your logic become more than your spiritual life, but there is a sense of logic that God gives us the wisdom to do things.
I mean, that's the balance too. Don't let your logic override, but on the other end, some people let their emotions override. So it's that balance between your logic and how you feel and holistic. We always talk about holistic part of a life here on this podcast. So
and then you know that you're going to have some sacrifices. You know that you're going to have some boundaries that you're going to have to create. So figuring that all out in all that spectrum too of getting the wisdom from other people, of thinking through it logically, of taking it to prayer, and listening to what God is saying. I mean, I don't know how it worked for you. Well, you said God kind of downloaded all this stuff, but how long did it take to get there? Was it right away? Was it a week? Because sometimes God doesn't answer you, and that's where I'm really getting this. Sometimes God doesn't answer you like
sure, and there's been plenty of times that it's taken a long time to get an answer. But in that particular prayer, because I think who knows who can understand the mind of God, right? Yeah. There was really serious work that God had planned to do in Charles through that. Of course, I didn't realize it at the time. That particular prayer, I got an answer immediately. Certainly that's not always the case.
No.
Yeah. And so I think we need to listen, hear what God's saying.
Absolutely. But you can't do that unless you're resting or being still. Yeah. That's when you hear his voice.
Exactly. And so hearing his voice and being able to filter through it and being able to hear the clarity of it, it is huge. So resting and being still and listening and waiting is a big component of that. But I do believe that this is God's intent for everyone, is that we're not stressed out, that we're not anxious, that we're not breaking at the seams and tearing at the seams. Yeah. But God wants us to have a life where we can rest, a life where we can rejuvenate. Gary and I were just talking about it before the podcast, before Brenda got here, is I was watching something a couple of years back that it talked about how our body is uniquely built, that we need rest 8 out of every 24 hours, and that is to get your muscles back in order, to get to get all of your blood flowing right, to do physiologically, we have to have that rest, and how uniquely we're made in that.
That's what we get pictured in creation. The seventh day was a day of rest, not because God was tired. It was a day to sit back and to reflect that this is all good. And I don't think we do that. You know what we do when we get a break? If we have a break, I'm speaking about myself, but I know all of you out there do the exact same thing. A break in my schedule just gives me time to check my email and social media. That's not a break. I struggle with, I'm kind of ADHD. I'm always on the move. When I realize I got 10,000 days left, I really have to put the pedal to the metal. And rest is hard for me, but I've forced myself to sit back and take, sometimes it's 10 minutes every couple hours. I'll do that. And if it really keeps me grounded, because when I get going, and then next thing you know, squirrel, then I have 4 squirrels and I end up 25 yards from where I ever started. So I think it's important piece that you don't hear talked about, you don't hear preached about much, to be honest, anymore. So,
I mean, we all need it. And so I think if you're sitting there and you're in a place of stress, you're in a place of angst, and that comes from your schedule, comes from your work. Maybe your pendulum is swinging way too far to the work side, and you need to center it more to the life side, or come back at least 60-40 or something like that. It'll only increase and better your relationships.
And I think the other piece we miss is you have children, so you're modeling something for them too. Yeah. And if you model that, well, I guess it's okay to work 100 hours a week, is what I think I did. Some of the ramifications in my family is my son hated church because it always took dad away from the family, which was not the message I was trying to send to my son. Again, that's on me too. So part of the thing that runs through your head is like, my life is modeling to my children, to my friend, to other coworkers who respect you. And so not only do I owe it to myself, I owe it to those that are watching my life, and to express it's time to take a break. It's okay. It's all right for rest.
Well, you just got back from that vacation. You needed that.
Yeah. And that was...
Ask him how many of those days on vacation did he actually vacate.
Let's talk about hours instead of how many days.
All right, I can speak to this. Okay, so I've known Jeremy for a long time, and I have never known him to take a vacation where you didn't hear back from him within 4 hours of any email or message you sent him. This vacation, there were times that I didn't hear back from him at all.
So did you applaud that or say?
I was shocked and impressed and happy for him.
Good, yeah.
And again, realizing that work-life balance in myself, that's where I've been over the last couple months. I mean, I'd even say 6 months is I used to work 45, 50, 60. I told Brenda this yesterday. I'm now around 40, give or take a couple hours. I'm around 40. And I don't necessarily turn on my stuff at home. And it's because I've realized that, I need to be present and there for my kids.
Yeah.
And I need to turn off, and we'll talk about this in the next podcast, but I need to turn off the email, turn off the phone calls, turn off the
social media,
the social media, but specifically to work, turn off my work mindset. It's okay to think about work at home. It's okay. But when you fester on it, when you sit there and constantly go through your day, go through your planning, that's where I was. And so getting away from that and creating those boundaries is important, because my pendulum was swinging away to the left. It was probably 60, 70, 80 to, 20, 30, and 40 over on the life side. And now I've tried to move it back to kind of get it more to center.
More, yeah.
And I feel like I have the same, I have the good integrity, I have the good work ethic, and so therefore I'm able to do that a little bit more.
Without feeling guilty?
Yeah, without feeling guilty, and put the pieces in place that enable me to do that. And that's where work's enabled me to put people in place to be able to do that. And now just continuing to train them so I can continue to center that pendulum is huge. Mm-hmm. And so I think that we all go through it. My niece, she's working at Chick-fil-A down the street. She's working 50 hours right now. And I'm just like, you're starting to set yourself up for burnout. Mm-hmm. And I had a breakdown moment with burnout myself a few years back. And that's when I started putting people into place. But she's setting herself up for burnout. So she has to figure out how to say no to some things and how to say yes to others. And how she has to build up her cachet, so to speak, with her bosses. But once she does that, she needs to start, setting boundaries so that she doesn't burn out.
I've said it several times on this podcast. The self-help industry is $1 billion a year industry that's mostly crap. But self-awareness is huge. Self-awareness says, oh, I'm out of balance. Self-awareness says, hey, I need help. Self-help says, oh, I can just go out and, I'm going to go out and stand in my garden and say, there's no weeds. And like, how stupid is that? Self-awareness says, hey, I need help. Hey, I feel this. And then you have to be intentional. Like, because I did the same thing you did. I think I had burnout. So I had to actually plan, because I didn't trust myself. I actually had to plan my vacations till we went somewhere where there was no Wi-Fi service, so I wouldn't even be tempted. That's how bad it got.
Clever solution, though. I'm proud of you.
Yeah, well, thank you. I guess, what we like to do, actually, after our second podcast, Jeremy says, I feel like we need to give something, like some tangible things to people when they listen, and we've always tried to do that. So maybe we could do that this way. A young mother, just little kids, comes to you, she's working, and she's like, I'm burned out. I don't have very good balance. What would you suggest I do? How would you sit with a younger version of you and over a cup of coffee and give her some tangible steps that she might be able to do?
Put me on the spot here. I wasn't prepared for that question. It's interesting. It's not interesting. It's life that one topic bleeds over into others. I'm sure you have found that when you've done your podcast.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, one of the values that we have in our family is that we live below our means.
Mm-hmm.
We could afford twice the house. We could afford brand new cars. There's a lot more that we could do, but we live way, way, way below our means. Now, our means are pretty generous at this point, but we have a philosophy in our family that at any point either one of us could lose. At any point the economy could, whatever.
Yeah.
So there is one of the things I preach to my children that I would, want to impart to a young mom is to set your life up with as small of fixed bills as possible, so that when you get jammed up, if you get jammed up, you have the flexibility to say, this isn't working.
Great.
I need to make a change, and I've got enough in reserves, or I can make the change, and there's some room.
Yeah.
Plus, it's just less stressful to manage fewer things in a smaller home, and so that would be that's the biggest thing is keep your fixed you can still spend money, take vacations, but keep your fixed bills small, so that when you get jammed up, you can make a change. Because very often that work-life balance thing, it's just the extra 7 or 8 hours a week that pushes you over the edge.
Yeah.
It's not that you can't work.
Yeah.
It's that extra, or it's the demands of that particular position. And fortunately, we're in a time when the economy is good. There are options. There are things that you can do. Don't be afraid to make a change. The other thing I would say is, when you have little kids, there's no such thing as work-life balance.
No, great point.
There's not. They demand more than any set of humans can possibly deliver. So rest in all of the unfinished things when your kids are little, because you'll never get to the bottom of the pile.
Yep.
I wish somebody had told me that.
Yeah.
Be assertive, and know that employers, they'll take what you give them. If you give them 60 hours a week, they will happily and graciously and gratefully take that, but they'll also gratefully take less if you set boundaries.
And I want to reframe that for you. So I wish somebody would have told you that earlier too, but you just told somebody now. And so somebody might be blessed hearing that from you that hasn't had anybody tell them yet either. So that's why we do this, because we understand there's power in story, and our stories aren't just for us. They're for other people too. And that's the basis of what we do here when we interview people.
Yes. So if you're in a place where your work-life balance is out of whack, I hope that you can glean some information from Brenda's story and from what we've been talking about this whole time, that you can make changes that will enable your life to become more fruitful, to become more usable for God's purposes. Mm-hmm. Also, that it can grow and bless and increase your relationships and the depth of your relationships. Because I think that's what it's all about. It's all about deepening those relationships, deepening your relationship with God. And when you're so stressed and busy, those are times where I think the devil just kind of says, okay, hey, you know what? You can't say yes to this because you have all this junk going on. When your bills are so out of whack, your fixed costs, like Brenda said, you can't afford not to say yes to work.
Correct.
So with that, if that's a place where you're at, I hope that you can get something out of this. I hope that you can evaluate and identify those places in your life and make change. Mm-hmm. So hopefully that's been a blessing to you, and hopefully you've enjoyed listening. And if it's not you, hopefully you can share it with someone who you feel like that may be maybe a problem or a hindrance to them. So we hope that you hear this. We hope that you have been able to identify those things. We hope that you're able to make changes. We have had such a great time. Thank you, Brenda, for coming in.
Brenda, thank you.
And telling your story. If you want to get in touch with us, if you have questions about how that looks, if you have questions about what you can do, if you want to share your story of that.
Maybe they want to, if someone wanted to talk to you and they email us, I'd love to talk to you from a woman-to-woman perspective. Would you be open to that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Cool. So you can get in touch with us a couple different ways, and that is going on any of our social media platforms, which is Facebook at RP Podcast, Instagram at RP Podcast, and Twitter at the RP Podcast. Or you can get on our website and contact us through that, or listen to any of our previous podcasts as well, and that is www.rppodcast.com. And we would love to hear from you and love to hear your stories or hear your questions or just have you become part of the conversation. So do that if you feel led. And we just had a great time today and hope that you got a lot out of it, and hope that you have a great week. And thank you so much for listening.